With the development of industries around the world, greenhouse gas emissions have increased. Climate change caused by greenhouse gases has become one of the most serious environmental problems facing mankind. Already we have seen its impact on human lives in droughts, cold waves, and tsunamis. Climate change and green growth were two of the major topics discussed at the 2015 Jeju Forum. Discussions were focused on securing and delivering financial resources to boost economic growth in developing countries while minimizing climate impact. The Global Green Growth Institute, or GGGI, was established in 2010, with Korea taking a leading role. At this year's Jeju Forum, the Institute enhanced cooperation with other international organizations, showing its stronger influence within the global community. We are joined by Yvo De Boer, Director General of GGGI, to hear more about his vision of green growth.
We have Mr. Yvo De Boer, Director General of GGGI. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Let me get right to it. GGGI has come a long way, hasn't it? It started out as a nonprofit organization and made it to an international organization in 2012. And you've been the Director General for just about a year. Can you share with us what has been some recent accomplishments and developments?
Well, you're right, it's a very young organization. It was only established a little over 2.5 years ago as an international organization. I think one of our achievements is that we now have 24 member countries, and they're a fantastic mix of countries. There are 5 countries from the so-called G20, so larger economies like Korea, Australia, the United Kingdom, then a number of middle-income countries like Indonesia, a number of countries from the Middle East, but also a number of very poor countries like Senegal and Rwanda. So our membership really represents a very rich mix of countries. So I'm very happy with the growth of that membership and the way we've really managed to build a program that works with countries on discovering a greener model of economic growth.
Right. You have a lot of developing countries as a member, as the organization should have. In this forum, Jeju Forum, you held a session, and the theme was increasing the developing countries' access to the climate finance. Could you share us a little bit more about the topic, and why do you think it's the important topic?
It's a critical topic because many countries, not just developing countries, but rich countries as well, including countries like Korea, ask themselves the question, how can we, on the one hand, address climate change, which is important, but at the same time continue to grow our economies, to create jobs, to lift people out of poverty. That really is a dilemma. So many developing countries in the international climate process are looking for financial support, that will help them to make that transition to a greener model of economic growth. The question then is, why is that finance not flowing? Is it not flowing because there's not enough investment capital in the world? Or is it not flowing because perhaps the investment conditions in developing countries are right, or are not right, I should say. And the session we organized yesterday focused on those questions. Is there enough capital out there? Is the capital flowing to developing countries? And what should developing countries be doing to make themselves more attractive for green investments?
I see. Does that relate to what GGGI is doing with developing countries and emerging countries? Could you give us some example of what GGGI is doing with the countries around the world?
Yeah, in a general sense, we begin by working with countries to do an assessment of what green growth could mean for them. So where are the risks, the opportunities in relation to green growth? Could that be on clean energy, or different agricultural practices, or different transportation systems? And once we've done that assessment, we work with countries to then implement strategies in 4 main areas. The first is energy, the second is green cities, the third is water, which is a very important topic in many countries, and the fourth topic we work on is land use. And our programs vary quite a lot from country to country. For example, in the Philippines, we're working to make villages resilient to the impacts of climate change. That's important because actually 85% of the Philippine economy is vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So if we can make cities, villages more climate resilient, that's very important. In Vietnam, we've just worked with the government to develop a series of investment guidelines that help the government to understand better how they can attract green investments and drive green investments into the economy. In Mexico, we're working on transportation systems. In Rwanda, we're working on creating off-farm jobs, so rural jobs in small and medium-sized towns. So what we do really is really determined by the nature of the country in question and the priorities of the country in question.
I see. Let's talk about the difficulties. It's fascinating that a lot of countries are interested in that, but isn't there a perception, based on reality or not, that the concept of green growth or sustainable growth is not really in an equal par with the economic growth agenda that countries might have? They might say that this is an either-or proposition rather than it's a harmonious concept. How do you deal with that difficulties? Do you persuade them in certain ways, or do you have you developed some logics to give to these countries?
Well, the only way that you can really persuade countries is by showing them a good model of economic growth, a good alternative model of economic growth that will be better from a societal point of view than the conventional model of economic growth. I mean, if green growth was easy, we wouldn't need to spend so much time talking about it. The world would be full of fantastic examples to follow, and an institute like mine would not need to exist because everybody would be doing green growth. The fact of the matter is it's not easy, and part of the reason that it's not easy is because many existing economies around the world, including the Korean economy, are very energy-intensive economies, very resource-intensive economies. So for an economy like Korea to take a different direction, you really have to explore properly where the opportunities lie, and how can you allow the Korean economy to continue to grow? How can you continue to provide people with jobs, but in a greener and more innovative direction? And I think if you can show real examples of how that can be made to work, then people will be convinced. If it's just stories, no one will be convinced.
I think that would be the difficulties that a lot of countries are going through. And in fact, the climate change, that agenda itself has gone through that kind of a dramatic kind of skepticisms and cynicism even. And it seems like you were involved in that right from the get-go. Now, you just talked about the examples to give, but can the advanced countries provide those kind of examples? I mean, the advanced countries are involved in the GGGI effort, but what are their roles in that organization's overall scheme?
Well, one important role that they have is to provide us with financial resources for us to do our work, which I think is very important. But they also provide us with a number of examples of how you can make green growth happen. For example, the United Kingdom has been very successful in creating a green investment bank. Denmark, which is one of our members, has developed a fantastic and very profitable wind energy industry. Germany, which contributes to our programs, has made a big shift to renewable energy. So there are good examples that we can take from industrialized countries, but there are also good examples that we can take from other countries. Developing countries like China, for example, which for many years thought that acting on climate change would be very expensive and very bad for the economy, are now actually leaders in many of the key technologies that we need to address climate change. China is now a leader on wind technology, solar technology, battery technology, fuel cell technology. So actually, if the international community begins to take climate change seriously, that will mean a big economic benefit for China, because China is beginning to change the direction of its economic growth.
Yeah, so the perception is changing in many different countries. So do you think that you're reversing the tide in terms of bad publicities about the climate change and what cost that developing countries might be paying?
I think it would be arrogant for me to say that we're changing the tide. I think we're making a small contribution. We're a small institution, but what I like about the place that I work is that we focus on real strategies, on real examples, on real business alternatives for countries. So we're not talking theory, we're not writing books. We're sitting down with countries and saying, well, what are your specific circumstances, and how can we work with you to find a greener model of economic growth that is suited to your circumstances?
I see. Along the same theme, let's talk a little bit about Korea. Korea has led lent some leadership in establishing GGGI, and they contributed in a financial terms as well. But as an environmentalist, do you think that Korea is a role model in that effort?
I think Korea, to be honest, is struggling at the moment. I think a few years ago, when the economy was doing better, it was easier for political leaders in Korea to propagate the green message. Now the Korean economy is not looking as good as it was a number of years ago. The Korean economy is very energy intensive, it's very resource intensive, and that means that the Korean economy is very sensitive to international competition. In other words, if Korea does expensive things to address environmental concerns, it could lose business internationally. So that is a struggle. At the same time, I think there is a vision on the part of the current Korean leadership that the economic model that made Korea successful in the past can not be the economic model that makes Korea successful in the future. Mm-hmm. In my view, and this is a bit of a caricature, but in my view, Korea has only one natural resource, and that one natural resource is the brains of the Korean people. So in other words, the economic model that makes Korea successful in the future is going to be a model that relies on human intelligence and on innovation, rather than using a lot of energy and a lot of natural resources.
Mm-hmm. I think that might explain the kind of cynicism that people might have towards the Korean situation at this point. What I mean by it is that the government has preached this green growth for a number of years, but if you look at the participation from private companies in Korea, it's meager, it's very insignificant at this point, especially their participation in the carbon emission trading system this year is very small. How do you see this thing as, is that a failure from the government, or is it something that the Korean corporation should really get to what they should be doing in terms of maybe social responsibility matter or as a business strategy?
Well, I think not all Korean companies are the same. You have big companies, medium-sized companies, and small companies. You have in Korea companies that are focused on steel, on shipbuilding, energy-intensive industries, and you have companies that focus on innovation. So in the Korean economy, just like in any other economy in the world, there are companies that will benefit from aggressive climate change action, and there are companies that could suffer from aggressive climate change action. And what you're hearing at the moment in the media is the big energy-intensive companies who are afraid that emission trading, a price on carbon, will hurt their international competition. What you don't hear so much are the smaller innovators, the companies working on battery technology, the companies working on semiconductors, the companies working on new ICT solutions, the companies working on energy solutions, who actually see a bright future in acting on climate change. And the difficulty for any political leader is, how do you strike that balance? How do you find a way forward that offers opportunities to the innovators without destroying too many jobs too fast in the old economy?
I see. It seems like there is a two fronts on that one. There's a system itself, the carbon emission trading system itself, with a lot of the oppositions and also the support as well. But it seems like there is a kind of Korean companies is trying to incorporate that strategy into them. We see efforts on some of them, but most of them is trying to stay away from it because they feel that it kind of takes the competitive edge away from them. Probably that's something that they have to really look at the evidences, where they have to look at the examples that organizations like GGGI might show them.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think always in life, the people that have, the people that object to something are screaming the loudest and making the most noise. So what we hear at the moment very vocally are the Korean companies that think they are going to suffer from a carbon price. At the same time, there are many other Korean companies that can help to drive innovation into the Korean economy, but you don't hear those companies so loudly. So the challenge, I think, for the politicians in Korea is to look at the big picture, to find the balance, to recognize that the agenda has to be innovation, and that Korea needs to be part of a global solution, not part of a global problem.
I see. Kind of broadening our vision a little bit. I think that the global collaboration would be very important, and in that sense, there is a very important climate change conference coming up in Paris. Given kind of a drama and kind of a tumultuous past that they have, probably there's a lot of expectations on your part personally as well, because you are so deeply involved in it. What kind of agenda do you expect, and what kind of outcome do you expect from the Paris event at the end of the year?
I think in some ways reaching an agreement in Paris has become a little bit less complicated. When I was involved in the climate negotiations a few years ago, people and countries were calling for an international legally binding treaty. That is not being called for now, and that makes things politically easier. Secondly, I think countries recognize now that the climate problem is not going to be solved in one go, that we probably need more conferences, more years, more attempts in order to get to a final result. So I think countries' expectations for Paris are more realistic than they were a few years ago. That will make it easier to achieve a success. Mm-hmm. My ambition for Paris is not to solve the whole issue at once, but rather to get the train out of the station, to get the ball rolling, to ensure that all countries begin to engage to address climate change.
I see. Not only all the countries, but I'm remembering what you alluded earlier. This whole effort is not just the economic means. It's not just about the economic aspects or some political aspects, but it requires to all the other aspects of the society, doesn't it? It involves their lifestyle. It requires a reconsideration on how we develop our industries, in what manner and what areas. So in that sense, the collaboration in many different levels might be important. Zeroing on the organizations, you might have to work with other international organizations to address those issues, rather than just looking at climate convention as kind of one-stop shop to solve these problems. I think I agree with you that it is unrealistic. In that sense, GGGI, do you think you have some plans in place to work with other organizations to address maybe other important issues?
Yeah. Well, in fact, we work together with a lot of different organizations around the world. We work with the World Wildlife Fund. We work with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. We work with the United Nations Development Bank. We work with the Asian Development Bank, so a wide variety of institutions that are focusing on different aspects of the development agenda. And that's because you're absolutely right. Society as a whole needs to be convinced. People need to understand that acting on environmental issues is in their interest, that they can still provide a prosperous future for their children while addressing environmental issues at the same time. And that can only be achieved through collaboration.
Right. In that sense, there is an aspect of kind of north-south collaboration, but also south-south collaboration. So we're looking at the triangular aspect of it. So in terms of development goals and other projects going on, especially with the infrastructure and others, do you think that the GGGI should be getting involved more in kind of financing of infrastructure and also the setting of development goals in each countries?
Getting involved more in financing infrastructure, I think, no. There are, to my mind, enough financial institutions out there already. We have commercial banks, we have development banks. Newly, an Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank has been created. So I don't think we need to become the next financial institution. What we are focusing on very much is working with governments to develop strong proposals that those governments can take to the financial community for investment, for financing. So we're really working as financial advisors to governments rather than having the ambition to provide financing ourselves.
I see. I think a lot of people are pulling for you because of what you've done and achieved, despite all kinds of noises coming from all over the corner, and especially the United States as well. But it seems like you're weathering the storm. So a lot of people are rooting for the success in the GGGI. If you can share kind of last words of encouragement or advice to those countries and people who are working on the green growth and have an ambition and interest in the green growth, what would you say to them?
I would say don't look for the future in the past. Look for the future in the future. I think we have economic models in place that have taken many countries, including Korea, to prosperity. Korea is where it is today as a result of energy-intensive industry, resource-intensive industry. So that manufacturing model of economic growth has taken Korea to great prosperity. Mm-hmm. But resources in the world are limited. We are damaging the environment very badly at the moment, and I think there are big opportunities for innovation by thinking differently, by discovering new economic models, by being more efficient. And Korea has demonstrated such fantastic things in the area of innovation, so I would encourage Koreans to focus on innovation.
Mm-hmm. On that hopeful note, thank you for your insight and sharing your stories with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Korea has signed FTAs with 15 different countries, and 5 of them were established after President Park Geun-hye took office. From FTAs to the participation in the AIIB and TPP, Korea has recently been focusing on broadening multilateral cooperation with other countries. This year's Jeju Forum has become a venue for multilateral cooperation in the fields of diplomacy, security, and economy, and it has garnered much attention from renowned global experts. Among the participants at the Jeju Forum, Upfront had a chance to meet Clare Fearnley, ambassador of New Zealand to Korea, who is an expert on Asia with close ties to Korea. It's been 53 years since Korea has established diplomatic ties with New Zealand. On March, the two countries officially signed an FTA, which expanded Korea's economic territory into Oceania. New Zealand was one of the combatant countries during the Korean War, and in 2014 it became a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, taking Korea's place. This shows a special relationship between the two countries in a variety of fields including economy, security, politics, and diplomacy. Let's meet Clare Fearnley, ambassador of New Zealand to Korea, to discuss the importance of the Korea-New Zealand relationship.
We have Ambassador Clare Patricia Fearnley here with us. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, you have been ambassador to Korea for about less than 6 months. So I guess that this is the first time participating in Jeju Forum.
It is, and in fact, it's my first time to Jeju.
Oh,
so
I
it's
see.
been a great visit. I've been really impressed at the natural environment, the greenness, the infrastructure. It's been a very, very enjoyable time here. But the forum itself also has been great. For me, it's been a particular opportunity to renew some old friendships. I've worked in regional issues for a while. And yesterday at the East Asia Forum, there were a lot of familiar faces there, and again today. So it's been a great opportunity to renew some friendships, and also to catch up on what the current thinking is on regional issues. That things are moving so quickly. It's a useful point to check back in, to share views, to hear views.
I see. On that point, what sessions or kind of topics that interest you or they impressed you most?
I think so far, I'm partway through the forum. I think so far I got a lot from the East Asia Forum discussions yesterday on regional integration, both on the economic side and in terms of non-economic issues. Hearing about some of the new concepts that are being developed, including in the ASEAN +3 model, which is, the ASEAN countries plus the North Asian 3 countries, Korea, Japan, China, and the objectives of working toward an East Asian community. That area of regional integration is moving the thinking is moving quickly. Sometimes the reality doesn't keep up with some of the aspirational thinking, but concepts are evolving very quickly.
I see. Let's talk about the economic subject matter, which is, I think the most important thing or the interesting thing that happened between our respective country is the FTA that was signed in March. First of all, I think you were involved in that process in various aspects. What's your overall impression or the expectation or impact on that process?
It's been a long process. It's taken, I think, almost 15 years since we first began preliminary discussions about would it be possible to do an FTA together between Korea and New Zealand. And then the negotiations launched formally in 2009, and they started and stopped and started and stopped. So it's been a really challenging process. So I think now that we've come through to conclusion, there's a huge sense of satisfaction that together we've been able to do this. The FTA was hard negotiated, and I have to say Korea's FTA negotiators are the first in the class, I think. They're very tough, very competent and very experienced FTA negotiators. So I think neither side is completely, fully 100% satisfied with all aspects of it. However, it represents real progress in terms of our economic relationship, and it represents the best achievable compromise between our two countries. So now that we have it secured and signed in March, it's time now to help our business people, our traders, our service providers, our investors from both countries take advantage of the new provisions and the new arrangements between our countries to increase economic contacts.
Right. Let's dig a little bit deeper into the FTA. In what areas or what industries do you think that this FTA holds most promises?
I think it's an unusual FTA for New Zealand at least, in that all of our previous FTAs have been new territory where New Zealand's led the way in negotiating FTAs with the country concerned. This one's different for us. It's a catch-up FTA, and in fact, FTAs that Korea has concluded over the last 10 years with other countries. Chile was one of the first, and then of course the chorus with the US,
right,
the European Union, Australia, Canada. In fact, the access that we're getting now through the FTA is really access that those other countries are already enjoying. So for us it's an unusual FTA. It's catching up to the sorts of access into Korea that other countries are already enjoying. And so that's one aspect of it. I think another aspect of it is that it's unusual for us to exclude certain products from an FTA, but in this case, at Korea's request, we've excluded from the FTA some of the sensitive products that Korea focuses on in the agricultural sector. It's an unusual list of products. It includes things like persimmons and apples and pears and all agricultural products. Also, rice isn't covered, and I know that rice is very sensitive for Korea, but then New Zealand doesn't produce, and for other countries,
many
that's
Asian
true.
Countries
but
well.
New Zealand doesn't produce rice, so we're no threat to Korea's rice growers. So yeah, I think agriculture was a very difficult area and very challenging, and I think was why perhaps the negotiations took quite so long.
Right.
But that's one side of it. I think another side is looking at all of the sectoral cooperation that will come as a result of the FTA. There are provisions in there on agricultural cooperation, on fisheries and forestry cooperation. We both have very vibrant film and IT sectors, so there's provision in there relating to particularly film and television cooperation. And I think the people-to-people elements are also really important. There's scope for 3,000 young Koreans to come on working holiday schemes to New Zealand. So we're looking forward to welcoming more young Korean people. There are agricultural scholarships that New Zealand will provide to young Korean farmers and rural people to come and study in New Zealand. And also special visa access for certain categories of Korean skilled workers who might want to come and work in New Zealand for some overseas experience.
I see.
So it's quite a rich FTA, covering quite a lot of different areas.
You said it's a very peculiar FTA, but I'm curious, Korea has been very diligent and very busy entering into FTAs all over the world. Now, having other FTAs already having done, does it make it easier? Do you think it made it easier to see what kind of models, what kind of process that Korea has gone through?
Definitely, and the models have evolved over the years, and you can see it particularly in the services sector, where we started off in our early FTAs with services chapters that looked very much like WTO services commitments, but they've evolved greatly in the last decade, so that they now look rather different, and that overlap between services and investment, they actually overlap quite closely, is now reflected in the way we structure FTAs as well. So, you know, the other thing I'd say too is that it's much better to be negotiating between two experienced set of negotiators than between an experienced and inexperienced set, because then there's a lot of learning that's needed to go to get the less experienced party to the point of really being able to clinch a deal.
Trial and error is minimized.
That's right. And in the case of Korea and New Zealand, it was two sets of quite experienced negotiators dealing with each other. So I think that actually helped the process.
Right. You did mention that the process was pretty long, and also the agricultural sector was a pretty hard one. And in fact, in Korean farmers have been up in arms about the harms that it will cause to their industries. So from your perspective, is it a case where the FTA is some industries win and some lose, so it's a win some, lose some kind of case? Or if you have an advice to how to deal with this agricultural sector who's feeling very insecure about this FTA?
Well, that's a very interesting one. I think the activities of the agricultural groups in Korea have been focused on other economies rather than New Zealand's, by and large. I think Chorus, the US one, was the big hurdle to get over in a way, and the biggest focus for concern from agricultural interest groups. I mean, what I'd say about the New Zealand FTA is that the scale of our agricultural exports to Korea, I mean, currently we account for less than 4% of all of the food imports that Korea has. New Zealand is only 4%. So I think the scale is relatively modest, and probably is something that the scale, I'll just leave it at that, to say the scale is modest. Also within the agriculture chapter, again, I compliment the effectiveness of the Korean negotiators, because there are limits on some of the most sensitive sectors. For example, milk powder, there's a volume cap on milk powder. No fresh milk will be imported, and the local producers have a real advantage in providing fresh milk, a high value product, direct into the local market that we can't compete with. So that's an area that's not going to be impacted significantly. So I think the other thing I'd say too is that a lot of our exports to Korea are counter-seasonal. So at the season that we're exporting is a quiet season in Korea where they're not producing, so they're not in direct competition. And one of the really good examples of how this can work is something I went and visited yesterday. Actually, there's a cooperative network of 150 kiwi fruit growers here in Jeju who are working directly with the New Zealand kiwi fruit industry, Zespri. And Zespri has provided them with the best vines, the best kiwi fruit DNA, has provided the vines, and has shared agricultural technology on how to increase both the quality and the volume of the fruit. And this has been going since more than 10 years, since I think it started in 2004. And now it's got to the point where the fruit grown in Jeju is now being exported under the Zespri brand to third countries.
I see.
We're selling into other countries. So I think that's a really good example of how...
That is a good example, but how appropriate New Zealand and Kiwis and Kiwi, of course, when we refer
to New Zealanders, we're Kiwis, of
course. It's
course.
a kiwi bird, right?
That's right.
And not the kiwi fruit.
And we call ourselves Kiwis as
That's
well.
right.
It's our national nickname. So I think it's a very good example. But there's other ones too. For example, our deer industry is working with the Korean deer industry and the Korean ginseng industry to do research and development together with a view to selling advanced health products into third markets.
I see.
And into Korea as well, and
that's
New
a
Zealand.
collaboration models that
That's
we can
right. It
build
was
on.
one of the...
Yeah, I was going to say something. I was going to probe something about the dairy industry, because New Zealand obviously has a very advanced dairy industry, and rather than compete with it and feeling defeated among the dairy farmers in Korea, is there a way to advance this collaboration so that the advanced nature or the technologies or whatever knowledge that is built up can be beneficial to the farmers?
We're very supportive of that sort of industry-to-industry collaboration. And again, I should say that the FTA has been shaped, and as I said earlier, complementing the FTA negotiators on their negotiating skill, has been shaped in a way to ensure that there isn't direct competition between imported product and the highest value products being produced domestically, like the fresh milk, which is, a very important part of the market for local producers. They sell high value, high quality milk direct into the local market. There's no competition with that. And similarly, there are volume caps on on milk powders as well, as an example. Certainly on the food and beverage and food production side, I think there's lots of scope, and there's cooperation already happening between Korean and New Zealand food and beverage producers using dairy products. So I think that's probably a very lively area. And our technology too, much of it is suitable for use in Korea, so there's the ability to share that sort of technological know-how.
Are those government-driven, or do you see a lot of government kind of private sector partnership in making those happen?
The private sector has to lead the way, but one of the good things about the FTA is that it includes a whole chapter on agricultural cooperation, and so there's lots of scope to be discussing ways to facilitate the industries to work together, the two industries in both countries, including the dairy industry.
I see.
Yeah.
Let's shift it a little bit. We've been talking about the kind of economic terms, and you did mention that there are other factors like a lot of tourists and also students going to New Zealand. And not only the work holidays, there are about 6,000 students studying in the New Zealand, and annually I think that the number amounts to about 50,000 in terms of the tourism. And also you also mentioned that the movie industry, the Lord of the Rings, and the way you turned it into kind of a collaborative tourism industry. I think that's a very advanced model in my sense. It's just the one-off entertainment industry, but made it very sustainable, utilizing the nature that the New Zealanders are blessed with.
Well, I think we've been very fortunate, particularly, the movie industry really took off about 15 years ago. We've always had we had a sort of a niche boutique movie industry, but Hollywood came to New Zealand almost 15 years ago and has stayed really. So we've been fortunate to have a number of large-scale productions, but we also have a very lively, vibrant domestic film industry. And I'm struck by the amount of commonality with Korea, because Korea has a very lively domestic industry with also collaboration with Hollywood. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from each other. On the tourism link, it's true. I'm amazed that New Zealand continues to do market analysis and continues to find that a really strong motivator for travel continues to be the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit movies.
I see.
And
after all these years.
After all these years, it amazes me that even now, and this is many years after the first Lord of the Rings movie came out, that continues to be a motivator for travel, and we continue therefore to put funding into promoting in that area. But I was struck yesterday when we were going out to visit some of the kiwi fruit farmers yesterday morning in Jeju. We were driving along and I saw the characters up for Daejanggeum, the Daejanggeum village in Jeju, and I thought, here in Jeju, but I'm in the middle of watching Daejanggeum in all of its 50-something episodes.
Right.
I think I'm up to 37 or so. But it struck me that, of course, Jeju itself also has a great example of that linkage between film and tourism. I think beyond film strictly, I think ICT is another area where our two countries have a lot to offer each other, particularly in the gaming sector. I mean, Korea is very strong in gaming, but also New Zealand gamers are competing or producing product that receives a very warm welcome internationally. So I think this is another area. We have a trilateral ICT summit that includes gaming and all sorts of other creative areas. Every year it moves between Korea, New Zealand and Australia, so it's a trilateral ICT summit.
I see.
And I think that's a good example too of how the government's trying to get in and support the linkages between our industrial sectors.
Right. Let's shift a little bit again to regional role that New Zealand has. Starting with this story about the AIIB. New Zealand was the first non-Asian country to join the AIIB, and that fund, they call it the Chinese World Bank, has a particular focus on infrastructure. Is a sector involving infrastructure a particular interest of New Zealand, or
yes, it is.
What's the logic in it?
Yes, it is. I mean, we do have commercial interest in infrastructural development in the region. We don't have an equivalent to Hyundai, maybe, or some of the larger infrastructural chaebol that Korea has. We have more niche commercial interests. So yes, we do have the commercial interest, but I think our interest goes much beyond that. I think for a region, we all benefit, New Zealand, Korea, we all benefit from a region that's seamlessly integrated. I think that's what we're aiming for out in the future. And certainly if you look at organisations like APEC and others, that's all about trying to achieve seamless economic integration in our region. And to do that, you need infrastructure that works. And that's not just international cross-border infrastructure. You also need domestic infrastructure that hooks up economies to their neighbours and to the wider region. So we see, frankly, direct benefit to New Zealand in having an upgraded infrastructure in the Asia-Pacific region. So, that's clear to us.
I think the logic for the infrastructure is very solid for many countries in Korea, in Asia, and Korea also can look back upon the history and say that, well, that was one of the foundations that made Korea possible to advance this much. But as you mentioned, very interestingly, the agony that Korea had was a little bit political, wasn't it? U.S. and China, there was some little bit of the hegemony kind of competition in the region. How much of that, I don't want to kind of lure you into sensitive areas, but at the same time, is there some kind of regional governance structure, or is there some realities that all the countries here has to share and kind of partake so that we'll have a harmonious kind of workings on in the economically and also politically?
I can't represent the views of other countries, so I'd have a difficulty in saying what's in the minds of other countries, but what I can say about my own country's views on this issue are around that shared interest that the new institution be an institution that has really high governance standards and adopts best practice, international best practice. Now, what I'm heartened by is the fact that I'm hearing the same thing from the range of countries engaged in AIIB, including China. And I think from our conversations with China and other key players within the AIIB, there's a sense that to be credible, to attract in the membership that we all want to see, it's got to be a international best practice standard institution. So I think we're all agreed on that, and we're all committed to seeing that happen. And right now, our the various countries that are involved in this early stage of the AIIB are actively putting in place the framework and the operating procedures against which the AIIB will be judged. So I think we need to take a look at those, the outcome from that discussion and negotiation, and I expect the outcome to be, a credible, high quality governance system. The proof will be in the pudding.
Right, it will be. It will be. In fact, we can kind of expand it a little bit in terms of New Zealand's role in the region. New Zealand was to be, it's already a non-permanent member of the Security Council and the UN, along with the 5 other countries. In fact, New Zealand is replacing Korea.
That's right, effectively. That's right. Korea
so there was
left
a handover,
and we came in. Yes.
Right. In that sense, do you see the role that New Zealand can play or has a vision to play in the world politics and the peace and prosperity in the world?
Well, when we were campaigning for the seat, we made a very clear commitment, particularly to our immediate region in the Asia Pacific, that we would be, if we were successful, as we've been, we'd be a country that listened, that was fair-minded, that kept the door open to hear the views of even those that we disagreed with. And I think that's what we've brought in our first 4 or 5 months on the council. We really are committed to being a fair-minded member of the council. So it's challenging for smaller countries to cover the range of issues that are on the active agenda of the Security Council, but we've been preparing for this for more than 5 years. I have to say that we were very pleased to have the support of Korea as we prepared for the candidacy. We've learnt a lot from Korea by shared experiences, hearing how the Republic of Korea's 2 years had gone, the lessons that Korea had learnt, what we felt we could learn too from Korea's time. So we're very, very grateful actually to that support, and for the information and experience sharing.
I see. We started now this conversation mentioning that New Zealand helped us out in the World War II or Korean War. But it seems like through the FTA and the regional role that New Zealand has a vision to play, and also the global role, it seems like our friendship is continuing in many different areas.
I believe so, and I'm hoping that in my 4 years here in Seoul that we'll see a continued growth. I think it's true, history's been an important part of the relationship, trade is an important part, but there's just so much more that we can do together. And now all of that energy and effort that we've both been putting into completing the FTA, now that we've done that, all of that energy can be put into other aspects of the relationship. I'm very mindful of the tens of thousands of New Zealanders who have Korean ancestry, and that's an important community in New Zealand, a very productive, very well integrated part of the New Zealand society. In fact, we estimate that around 1 in 100 Kiwis are Korean Kiwis, and we have some fantastic examples from that community, one of which is Lydia Ko, the female golfer, who was born here in Seoul but was educated and raised in New Zealand. So the people-to-people links are very important, and I want to foster those while I'm here.
Yeah, I'm glad that we're ending on a very high and glad note. Okay, thanks for sharing your insights.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for the conversation today.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.